Between 1925 and 1930, the Britannia mine was the largest copper producer in the British Empire. 17% of the world's copper, pulled from a mountainside on the British Columbia coast and processed through a 20-story gravity-fed concentrator built into the cliff face above the ocean. 60,000 people from over 50 countries worked that mountain over 70 years. Then the copper price collapsed. Anaconda plugged the main tunnel with concrete and walked away. What came next was worse than the closure. 210 kilometers of abandoned tunnels began producing acid and dissolved heavy metals, 600 kilograms a day, turning a fjord into a dead zone where caged salmon died in 48 hours. Today, the concentrator is a museum. A water treatment plant runs in perpetuity, and the fjord has been designated a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. This is the story of a dying deer, a Bavarian fur trader, and Wall Street money, of a mountain that gave £1 billion of copper and demanded an eternity of consequence in return. Not through one disaster, through the same mineral, working both ways. Chapter 1. The Doctor, the Fisherman, and the Dying Buck. The story begins with a knock on a cottage door. Sometime in 1888, on the west side of Howe Sound, a deep fjord cutting north from Vancouver into the coast mountains of British Columbia, a fisherman known only as Granger approached Dr. Alexander A. Forbes. Granger carried copper-stained rock in his hands. He wanted $400 for the location. Forbes was a federal medical officer, assigned to care for local First Nations people who had survived a devastating smallpox epidemic. He lived modestly. He treated the sick, but he also had a sideline interest in chemistry and prospecting, and he knew what copper-stained rock meant. He agreed to pay, on one condition: they had to find mineral in place. Actual copper in the bedrock, not loose float. The expedition nearly killed them. Granger, Forbes later recalled, was no woodsman, and we had a terrible time over that ridge. They climbed nearly to the summit of Britannia Mountain, but late-season snow covered most exposures. They found nothing that first day. The next morning, working lower on the mountainside, Forbes spotted a buck deer and shot it. In its death throes, the animal kicked moss off a rock outcrop, and underneath, copper mineralization gleamed in the light. Forbes placed a shot of dynamite, good showing in place. He paid Granger the $400 and swore him to secrecy. Granger bought a boat. He sailed for Alaska. He was never heard from again. In a 1931 interview with the Vancouver province, Forbes, by then an old man, delivered what may be the driest one-liner in Canadian mining history. So the first discoverer of copper at Britannia was Mr. Granger, the second was Mr. Buck, and the third was Dr. Forbes. What Forbes did next is harder to explain. He worked the showing periodically for 8 years, visiting every summer for a week, prospecting the outcrop, but he never staked a formal claim. His reasoning was simple, and in hindsight, brilliant. Everybody was looking for gold. Nobody cared about copper. I visited the property every summer for 8 years. I working on it for a week, and never saw a human being on or near that mountain. In 1893, he traveled to Victoria and asked the provincial minister of mines for assistance. He was refused. His interest faded. In 1897, Forbes gave a chart showing the location of the copper to a man named Turner. It was a casual act. A chart passed from one hand to another. It would set in motion everything that followed. The Squamish Nation, the Squaxw7mesh Uxwamxw, had known Howe Sound for thousands of years before Forbes arrived. Petroglyphs found north of Furry Creek suggest the area was known as a source of red ochre, an oxidation product of iron sulfides, the same geology that Forbes's dying buck had uncovered. The copper had always been there. It just needed the right accident to bring it to the attention of people who would tear a mountain apart to get at it. Chapter 2. The Fur Trader's Fortune. In 1898, the claims were staked, not by Forbes, not by Granger, by a trapper named Oliver Furry, who had a cabin on the west side of Howe Sound, and for whom Furry Creek had been named since the 1870s. Furry didn't stake the claims in his own name. He staked the Britannia Group, including the famous Jane claim, as agent for Thomas T. Turner, a Vancouver furrier. Almost certainly the same Turner to whom Forbes had given his chart. He staked the Empress Group as agent for Joseph Boskowitz and his sons Leopold and David. Only a single claim, the Mineral Creek, went in Furry's name. As geoscientist W.G. Smitheringale noted in his 2011 paper, the chain of knowledge is tantalizing. If Turner received Forbes's chart and then hired Furry to stake the discovery, the entire mine, every ton of copper, every death, every dollar, traces back to that dying buck in 1888. What is certain is that the claims Furry staked covered all the main ore deposits of what would become the British Empire's largest copper mine. Whether by genius, by luck, or by following Forbes's chart with a compass, he got it right. There was a complication. A Vancouver merchant named W.A. Clark had reportedly grub-staked Furry on a 50-50 basis, obtaining miners' licenses in the names of family and friends for Furry to use. Clark then left for the Atlan gold rush. When he returned, he discovered Furry had staked the Britannia claims using other names entirely. The grub-staking agreement was undocumented. Whether Clark ever benefited remains unknown. Joseph Boskowitz, the man whose family name would dominate the early years, was a Bavarian-born Jewish fur trader who had been in Victoria since the 1860s. Born in Floss, Bavaria in 1835, he'd built a fortune catching pelagic seals across the North Pacific and Bering Sea. He ran stores on Lower Yates Street in Victoria, founded the Boskowitz Steamship Company, and sold pelts in San Francisco, New York, and London. His son Leopold purchased half of Furry's interest in the Empress Group, and in 1899, Leopold acquired the Britannia Group claims. The total price for the 5 Britannia Group claims was $20,200. Joseph named the Jane claim after his daughter Jane Boskowitz, born 1871. It was an act of tenderness, a father putting his daughter's name on a piece of a mountain. See, that name would become synonymous with both extraordinary wealth and catastrophic death. Development began in 1899 with a 6.5-kilometer horse trail cut from Britannia Creek to the Jane claim at roughly 1,000 meters above sea level. Howard Walters of Libby, Montana, purchased a 70% interest for $35,000 and enlisted 10 Vancouver business partners to form the Britannia Copper Syndicate. By 1901, the syndicate was nearly bankrupt. Enter George H. Robinson. Robinson was a mining engineer from Butte, Montana, with a resume that read like a history of American Western mining. He'd mapped underground workings at the Leadville silver mines in Colorado, managed the Drumlummon gold mine in Montana, organized the Tintic Mining Company in Utah, and served as chief consulting engineer to Fritz Heinze during the legendary Battle for Butte, the vicious legal war over copper claims that paralyzed Montana's courts for years. Robinson looked at Britannia and saw what others had missed: ore bodies 5 kilometers from tidewater, 50 kilometers by water from Vancouver, magnificent timber for building, and ample water for hydropower. Between 1901 and 1903, he acquired control by paying off syndicate debts, buying out Walters, and purchasing the Boskowitz family's remaining interest. Despite the name Britannia, derived from HMS Britannia, after which Captain Richards of HMS Plumper had named the mountain range around 1859, the capital was overwhelmingly American. British naval cartography named the place. New York money built the mine. Robinson secured financing from Henry Stern of New York and incorporated the Howe Sound Company under the laws of the state of Maine with share capital of $2 million. He appointed the Honorable Edgar Dewdney as president, a former lieutenant governor of British Columbia, a pioneer civil engineer who'd built the famous Dewdney Trail through the province's mountains in the 1860s. Dewdney stood 6'4" and lent political prestige. He would also, despite a lifetime of prominent positions, manage his finances so poorly that he died penniless in 1916. No pension, no savings. The former lieutenant governor of British Columbia, dead broke. But the man who mattered most was Grant Barney Schley. Schley was a partner in Moore and Schley, one of the largest brokerage houses on Wall Street. His clientele included Henry Huddleston Rogers and William Rockefeller. His brother-in-law was George Fisher Baker, known as the Dean of American Banking. Schley acquired a controlling interest in the Howe Sound Company and would steer Britannia's fortunes for the next decade. A remarkable footnote. During the Panic of 1907, Schley's firm nearly collapsed, requiring J.P. Morgan himself to intervene. Morgan brokered an emergency deal where U.S. Steel acquired Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company to save Moore and Schley, one of the most consequential financial rescues of the Gilded Age, an event that helped trigger the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Yet through the crisis, through the panic, through the near destruction of his own firm, Schley maintained steady funding for a copper mine on a mountainside in British Columbia that most people in New York had never heard of. By 1904, a 200-ton-per-day mill was commissioned. In 1905, the first shipments went to the Crofton smelter on Vancouver Island, yielding 285 metric tons of copper. Robinson died in 1906, never seeing his mine reach its potential. In 1908, all assets were consolidated into the Britannia Mining and Smelting Company, incorporated in British Columbia. The Howe Sound Company of New York became the holding company. The pieces were in place: a Bavarian fur trader's capital, a Montana engineer's vision, a Wall Street banker's backing, a dying deer's lucky kick. Now, someone had to run it. Chapter 3. The Autocrat's Mountain. In 1911, Schley installed J.W.D. E. Moody as general manager, and Britannia acquired its first true dictator. Moody had previously turned around Schley's ailing Tintic mine in Utah, and he brought the same philosophy to Howe Sound: absolute control over everything that moved. Moody refused to tolerate alcohol on the property. He required company permission for peddlers, canvassers, and entertainers to solicit residents. He ran Britannia the way a ship's captain ran a vessel in hostile waters, with total authority and no tolerance for dissent. The workers called him Britannia's autocrat. It wasn't entirely a compliment, but his technical contribution was decisive. He changed mining methods from expensive square-set stopping to shrinkage stopping, dramatically cutting costs. He launched an extensive exploration program. Under Superintendent R.H. Leach, the development work outlined nearly 1 million tons of ore grading 2.5 to 3% copper in the Fairview zone. And in 1912, Britannia became the first mine in British Columbia to successfully employ froth flotation, a mineral processing technology that separated copper from waste rock by exploiting the difference in how minerals interact with water and air. It was transformative. It made Britannia's low-grade, fine-grained ores economically viable. Mines around the world would eventually adopt the technique. The terrain Moody was trying to tame was staggering. Britannia Beach sits on the eastern shore of Howe Sound, a deep fjord flanked by mountains reaching 2,000 meters. The ore bodies sat 5 kilometers inland, at elevations around 1,000 meters above sea level. Until the mid-1950s, the mine was accessible only by water. The Union Steamship Company provided service, but there was no road. A 2-stage aerial tramway, over 5 kilometers long with a vertical drop of nearly 1,000 meters, carried ore from Jane Camp down to the mill. Getting supplies up was equally punishing. Getting injured men down could take hours. Then the First World War started, and copper became the most strategic metal on Earth. Shell casings, bullet jackets, electrical equipment for warships and field communications. The Imperial Munitions Board received most of Britannia's output. Production increased tenfold between 1905 and 1915. A second mill was completed in 1916, doubling capacity to 3,000 tons of ore per day. By 1915, the mine employed up to 900 men. In 1916, Britannia officially became the largest copper mine in the British Empire. To solve the problem of exorbitant shipping rates to the Asarco smelter in Tacoma, the company formed its own steamship operation in 1916, purchasing 2 old vessels, including the former Canadian government survey ship Quadra. Years later, after being sold in 1924, the Quadra would find a second career as a rum runner during Prohibition. A delicious detail that nobody at Britannia could have predicted when they loaded her hold with copper concentrate and pointed her south toward Puget Sound. But the mountain was not finished with the people who had dug into it, not by a considerable margin. Chapter 4. The Mountain Takes Its Due. Just after midnight on March 22, 1915, roughly 100,000 cubic meters of rock, snow, mud, and debris broke free from the northeast side of Mammoth Bluffs and roared down onto Jane Camp. Jane Camp, named for Joseph Boskowitz's daughter, was the main residential settlement, sitting at 1,050 meters elevation, 5.5 kilometers up the mountain above Britannia Beach. Workers lived there with their families. Children slept in those bunkhouses. The cookhouse served meals 3 times a day. In seconds, the camp was obliterated. Cookhouse, bunkhouses, engine house, store, offices, cottages, shacks, buried under approximately 15 meters of debris. 56 men, women, and children were killed. It was Canada's second deadliest landslide disaster, after the 1903 Frank slide in Alberta. Most bodies were never recovered. When the cause was geological, schistosity dipping steeply to the southwest created conditions favorable for toppling. Freeze-thaw cycles during early spring had saturated the fractured rock. A near-vertical crack had been photographed on the unstable bedrock ridge roughly 300 meters above the camp, a warning sign that went unheeded. Mining operations in the fractured rocks during 1914 may have worsened the instability. At approximately 12:45 a.m., workers at the base of the mountain noticed ore hoppers arriving empty and knew, instantly, that something catastrophic had happened above. A search party was sent up the mountain in total darkness. The mine's extreme isolation, accessible only by boat, made rescue agonizing. Hours passed before the scale of the disaster was clear. Mine Superintendent E.J. Donahue sent the first telegraph. Unable at present to advise exact number of dead, estimated at 50 and 15 injured. Shift boss Thomas McCullough dug through the debris relentlessly that night, searching for his wife and 5-year-old daughter. Survivor Harry Baxter described the moment of impact. Along about midnight came a terrific wind. It blew like the Furies, and in about 2 seconds, there was a noise which some of the boys thought was 300 cases of explosives going off in the magazine. Mrs. Owen, a miner's wife, mistook the onslaught for a hurricane. Howling winds, thunder, lightning, and eerie moans from the mountain above. Jane Camp was abandoned permanently. The mine did not close. WWI copper demand was too urgent. Construction began immediately on a new, safer settlement at the 2,200-foot level, known as the town site, or Mount Shear. Britannia buried its dead and kept digging. 6 years later, the mountain struck again. On the evening of October 28, 1921, after 12 hours of torrential rain, nearly 150 millimeters in 24 hours, a catastrophic flood ripped through Britannia Beach. The critical cause was human. The mining company had constructed a railway fill across Britannia Creek instead of a proper trestle bridge, effectively creating a dam. When a debris slide blocked the upper reaches of the creek, water backed up behind the railway fill. When both barriers failed, a wall of water reported at 20 meters high was released. 37 people were killed. 50 of 110 homes were demolished or swept into the ocean. 15 were seriously injured. The 35 families lost everything. The warning came too late. When the railway fill gave way, miners on duty 3 miles up the mountain saw what was happening. A call went over the private telephone line. Miss Ellen Patterson, telephone operator at the compressor plant, received it. She rang everyone connected, relaying the desperate message, "For God's sake, get out of your houses! Flood coming!" Before the warning could reach enough people, the water crashed down, tearing out transmission lines, plunging the village into total darkness. The stories from that night are extraordinary. Jim Emmett stood on the bridge screaming warnings over the roar of the water. He was swept into the torrent. His body was recovered in Howe Sound. Bert King, also on the bridge, was thrown clear and survived. William Lonan, a watchman, ran into the path of the flood to warn people and lost his life. Yip Bing, a Chinese worker who had arrived at Britannia around 1913 at age 17, who worked in the general store and made Chinese food and delivered herbal soup to miners, jumped onto a floating house and rescued the women still trapped inside. Burt Bacon dove into the raging river to rescue a baby on a piece of floating wreckage. An exceptionally strong clothesline was about the only thing that kept him and the newborn from being swept to their deaths. A coroner's jury found the Britannia Mining and Smelting Company responsible for criminal neglect for allowing the blocking of Britannia Creek. The finding carried no meaningful consequences. The company rebuilt. Homes were relocated to the north side of the creek, above the alluvial fan. Carlton Perkins Browning, who directed reconstruction, would go on to become the mine's transformative general manager through its peak years. 12-year-old Hannah Swanson, who survived the flood, gave an oral history account decades later. It was a pretty little town before the flood. The huge boulders half as big as this room, and huge trees. That's what was devastating. In the house we were in, it got pushed into another house. We got out through the roof. 93 people dead in 6 years. 2 catastrophes that would have closed most operations permanently. But Britannia had Wall Street money behind it, a war-driven market ahead of it, and something else. A stubbornness peculiar to mining communities, a refusal to let the mountain win. From the ashes of the 1921 flood and the fire that had already destroyed Mill No. 2 earlier that same year, something remarkable was about to rise. Chapter 5. A Cathedral on a Cliff. The San Francisco metallurgical engineering firm of Bradley, Bruff, and Labarth was hired to design the replacement. Built between 1922 and January 1923, in just 18 months, the No. 3 concentrator was constructed in concrete and steel, fireproof, permanent, and built to a scale that still staggers visitors a century later. 20 stories tall, 210 feet from base to top, 64 meters of industrial architecture stepping up the northwest face of Mount Shear, each level a horizontal processing band, the whole structure climbing the rock face like a staircase for giants. Its base was 209 feet wide and 271 feet deep. It remains Canada's last surviving gravity-fed concentrator mill. The engineering principle was elegant. Ore entered the building at its highest point, 230 feet above the base, and passed downward through 8 levels entirely by gravity. No pumps lifting material upward. No conveyor belts fighting the angle of the mountain. The mountain itself was the engine. At the top, jaw crushers broke raw ore into smaller pieces. The material then dropped into ball mills, massive drum-shaped machines filled with steel balls that pulverized ore into fine powder. The mine consumed 2.5 pounds of steel balls for every ton of ore milled. The powder was mixed with water and chemical reagents, xanthates and pine oil, for froth flotation, the same technology Britannia had pioneered a decade earlier. Copper-bearing minerals, hydrophobic, detached to air bubbles and rose as frothy concentrate. Waste tailings sank. The concentrate, grading roughly 40% metal content, was dried and piped directly from the bottom level into the hold of a cargo ship at the dock below. Inside, the sensory experience was overwhelming. Workers used hard rock air drills without ear protection. The cavernous interior featured massive exposed boulders where the building had been anchored to the living rock. Concrete platforms, enormous rotating ball mills, steep wooden stairs connecting levels, tanks of chemical slurry, and a permanent din that never paused. Grinding, vibration, rushing water, the constant percussion of rock being reduced to dust. Workers went deaf. They received no compensation. There was no appeal. Originally designed for 2,500 tons per day, the concentrator's efficiency was progressively increased. The Britannia deep cell flotation system helped triple mineral yield. By the early 1930s, it was processing up to 7,100 U.S. tons of ore per operating day. And the numbers that came out of that building between 1925 and 1930 were, by any measure, astonishing. In 1930, the single greatest year, the concentrator processed 7,100 tons of ore daily and produced 44 million pounds of copper. Britannia was confirmed by Parks Canada and the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada as the largest copper producer in the British Empire from 1925 to 1930. At the height of production, the mine supplied an estimated 17% of the world's copper. Beyond copper, the mountain yielded silver, gold, zinc, lead, cadmium, and pyrite. Over its full 70-year life, Britannia would produce over 1 billion pounds of copper, 250 million pounds of zinc, more than 5 million ounces of silver, over 450,000 ounces of gold, and more than 700,000 tons of pyrite, all pulled from approximately 50 million tons of ore, hauled through 210 kilometers of underground tunnels, spanning a vertical range of 1,750 meters, from above the clouds to below the sea. Peak employment reached over 1,200 workers. In 1929, approximately 1,100 men were on the payroll, 625 underground and 470 on the surface. The underground network would eventually stretch to 210 kilometers of development workings, with 8 separate ore zones: Jane, Bluff, Fairview, Empress, Victoria, Number 5, Number 8, Number 10, and Beta. The concentrator dominated the view from the water, and for more than 50 years, when arriving at Britannia meant a Union steamship voyage up Howe Sound, mountains rising sheer from black water on either side, and then that building appearing on the shore. A 20-story concrete and steel staircase climbing the mountainside, its windows catching the gray light off the Sound. There was nothing else like it in the British Empire. There is nothing else like it in Canada today. Chapter 6. 50 Nations on a Mountainside. Over Britannia's 70-year life, approximately 60,000 people from over 50 countries lived and worked on that mountain. A 1948 workforce snapshot shows the composition: 48% Canadian, 47% European, 2% classified as Oriental, and 1% American. The community was remarkably diverse and remarkably segregated. Britannia existed in 2 physically separated settlements. Britannia Beach, at shore level, housed the Concentrator, wharf, administration buildings, and residential areas. Mount Shear, the town site, sat at 670 meters elevation, built after the 1915 Jane Camp disaster, and became the primary residential center for mine workers. At its peak, the town site held roughly 850 people in 143 housing units, with beds for 350 in 3 bunkhouses and a hotel. Hundreds more lived at the beach level. The isolation was profound. Mountains prevented the sun from reaching the town site for 2 months every winter. Annual snowfall at the town site reached 30 feet. Workers couldn't leave except by scheduled Union steamship boat. The highway wasn't completed until 1955. The road to the town site not until 1952. Recovered wooden walkways connected buildings, necessary because without them, people could be buried between their front door and the general store. For a place this remote, the amenities were extraordinary. Libraries and reading rooms, with books exchanged between the 2 camps. A community club where everyone paid dues. Billiard rooms. A gymnasium with a professional instructor. A swimming pool completed in 1930. Tennis courts. A bowling alley. A roller skating rink. A dancing hall. A school built in 1916. A general store built in 1912. A hospital built in 1915. A cinema showing 2 movies weekly. Rent was $1 a room, with free water, cheap electricity, and no taxes. There was a line in the historical record that captured the place perfectly. No old people, no retired couples, no unemployed. E-peddlers were carefully checked at the main office. No thieves. No one locked their doors. There was no juvenile delinquency. A thriving social calendar pushed back against the mountain and the dark. Annual traditions included the crowning of the Copper Queen, running from 1926 to 1966, with school children voting for the Queen. The July 1st mining games featured drilling, mucking, diving, running, and bicycle decorating competitions. Burns night dances, New Year's balls, Halloween parties, first aid competitions, card parties, hobby clubs, theatrical productions. It was an ideal place for people to develop their own talents, one account recalled, and the place had more characters per unit than any other camp. But the diversity had hard edges. Chinese workers were subject to documented discrimination. Then government laws did not give Chinese workers the same rights as others. At Britannia, Chinese workers were not permitted to work as miners. They were confined to jobs as cooks or in stores. Yip Bing, the young man who had arrived at Britannia around 1913 at age 17, and who would later become one of the heroes of the 1921 flood, worked in the general store, made Chinese food, and delivered herbal soup to miners. The miners nicknamed him Dr. Y.B. because his soup helped heal the sick during the 1918 influenza pandemic. His granddaughter Shannon Yip has provided testimony about his life. A life of extraordinary service, lived within the walls of extraordinary restriction. Japanese workers formed a good part of the surface crew at Victoria Camp, but were housed in separate buildings. The historical record references a Jap bunkhouse at Jane Camp before the 1915 landslide. The physical layout of the camps reflected ethnic and occupational hierarchies, separate quarters for different groups in the early period, a geography of belonging and exclusion laid out in wood and concrete on the side of a mountain. And the work itself left its mark on the body. Miners working in wet sections of the mine found that after 4 to 6 weeks, their woolen long johns turned green from adsorbed copper. The copper made the fabric brittle. Eventually, the underwear simply disintegrated. No employer-provided protective equipment existed. The mine consumed steel balls at 2.5 pounds per ton of ore. It consumed its workers rather more quietly. The Britannia Mining and Smelting Company operated without a union for over 40 years, from 1904 to 1946. Scholar Catherine Rollwagen, in her BC Studies article on paternalism at Britannia Beach, documented how the company exercised strong control over every aspect of community life: housing, recreation, commerce, access, and employment. The company was described as very strict with its workers and difficult to work for. Workers had few safety precautions. They received no compensation for hearing loss from hard rock air drills. Workers unionized in 1946, affiliating with the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers, Local 663. The first strike lasted from July 1st to October 21st of that year, nearly 4 months. Union delegate Ken Smith was turned back at the American border in 1948 and arrested in Seattle during a subsequent attempt, caught up in Cold War anti-communist provisions of the Taft-Hartley Act applied to the Union's international leadership. The Cold War reached even into the tunnels of a copper mine on the British Columbia coast. By the late 1920s, Britannia sat at the summit of its own story. The largest copper producer in the British Empire. A 20-story concentrator processing 7,000 tons of ore every working day. A community of 50 nationalities living between mountains and ocean, connected to the outside world only by boat, governed by a company that controlled everything from housing to entertainment, sustained by ore that seemed inexhaustible. The mine had survived a landslide that killed 56, a flood that killed 37, a fire that destroyed a mill, a world war, a financial panic that nearly destroyed its principal backer, and it had emerged from all of it larger, more productive, and more profitable than before. But the mountain gives and the mountain takes. The richest ores had already been mined. The concentrator, for all its brilliance, was aging from the day it opened. And the copper market, the relentless, indifferent, global copper market, had its own plans for Britannia Beach. The peak was 1930, and everything that came after was the long way down. Chapter 7. The Long Way Down. The Depression arrived at Britannia the way weather arrives on Howe Sound, fast, from somewhere else, and without asking anyone on the mountain for permission. Copper fell to 5 cents a pound. Employment dropped from over 1,200 to roughly 400 by mid-1933. The concentrator that had been processing 7,000 tons a day slowed to a fraction of its capacity. The ball mills still turned, but they turned for fewer shifts, on fewer days, grinding ore that was worth less with every passing month. The mine survived, barely, by shifting to lower-grade ore that required larger-scale processing. This was not a strategy born of optimism. It was an acknowledgement of a fact that had been true since 1912. Most of the high-grade ore had already been mined and milled. The richest material, the ore that had built the empire and justified the investment, was gone. What remained was abundant but dilute. More rock per pound of copper, more energy per pound of profit, more cost per pound of everything. By 1938, production had recovered to 6,000 tons per day, and employment had climbed back to 1,324. But the mine never recaptured its late 1920s dominance. The concentrator was already 15 years old. The tunnels extended deeper, farther, into rock that gave up its metal more grudgingly with every passing year. The Second World War brought renewed demand for copper, but it also brought a labor crisis that nearly crippled the operation. In 1 year alone, 1,152 men quit for the armed forces, for shipbuilding, for any industry that paid more or offered a future that didn't involve riding a miner's train into pitch-black tunnels for 45 minutes before your shift even started. By mid-1946, only 400 men remained on payroll. The first strike followed almost immediately, July 1st to October 21st, 1946. The newly unionized workforce, Local 663, had 4 months of grievances to air after 42 years without a voice. Then came the moment that should have been the end. In March 1958, copper prices collapsed and operations were suspended. The company that had survived landslides, floods, fires, a world depression, and 2 world wars was reduced to 7 employees. 7. The Britannia Beach Mining and Smelting Company was placed in voluntary liquidation in 1959. The Howe Sound Company reopened the mine shortly after as a direct division rather than a subsidiary. But corporate reorganization couldn't fix what was fundamentally broken. The problem was structural, and it was permanent. Underground mining through 210 kilometers of tunnels and 1,750 meters of vertical distance was inherently expensive. Every ton of ore had to be blasted, mucked, hauled, hoisted, crushed, ground, floated, dried, and shipped through a mountain, in a rainforest, on a fjord. Meanwhile, the world was changing around Britannia in ways that made this kind of mining increasingly uneconomic. Massive open-pit operations were transforming global copper production. In Chile, Chuquicamata, the world's most productive copper mine, owned by Anaconda, moved ore with truck-sized shovels under open sky. The Zambian copper belt operated at dramatically lower per-unit costs. New Australian operations were coming online. These mines didn't need 210 kilometers of tunnels. They didn't need aerial tramways or incline railways or gravity-fed concentrators built into cliff faces. They scraped the Earth's surface with machines the size of buildings and shipped copper at prices Britannia couldn't match. And the concentrator still stood. The tunnels still ran. But the economics that had justified them were dissolving, slowly and irreversibly, like copper sulfate in rain. Chapter 8. The Poetic Irony of Anaconda. In January 1963, Anaconda Copper, through its Canadian subsidiary, Anaconda Canada Limited, purchased the Britannia property for a reported $4 million. The historical irony was rich enough to taste. George Robinson, the man who had made Britannia a mine 6 decades earlier, had served as consulting engineer to Fritz Heinze during the Battle for Butte, the legendary war over Montana copper claims. And Fritz Heinze's great rival, the company he had fought for years across courtrooms and mining tunnels, was Anaconda Copper. As one historian observed, the mine Robinson built was eventually purchased by the very company he'd spent years fighting against. If Robinson had been alive to see the sale, he might have appreciated the symmetry, or he might have considered it a betrayal. Either way, the mountain didn't care. Anaconda's geologist Glenn Waterman examined the geological data before the purchase and concluded that ore existed not only at the footwall but also in intermediate positions. This led to the discovery of the 040 and number 10 ore bodies, new deposits that might extend the mine's life. Anaconda began developing the number 10 shaft in 1963, with production expected by October 1970. It was a significant capital gamble. Real money poured into aging infrastructure on the hope that new ore would justify old tunnels. Then came the strike that broke the mine's momentum. On August 11, 1964, employees walked off the job. The work stoppage lasted approximately 7 months, until a settlement was reached on March 2, 1965, with the assistance of British Columbia's Minister of Mines, the Honorable Donald Brothers. When operations resumed, they resumed on a curtailed basis. The mine never fully recovered its pre-strike rhythm. During the Anaconda era, approximately 300 employees managed to produce 60,000 tons of concentrate each year, efficient by any measure, but operating on a scale that bore no resemblance to the peak years when 1,200 workers pulled 44 million pounds of copper from the mountain in a single year. And then, Anaconda's own world fell apart. In 1971, Chilean President Salvador Allende expropriated Anaconda's massive Chilean copper mines, Chuquicamata and El Salvador. These were Anaconda's crown jewels, the operations that generated the bulk of the company's revenue and justified its global ambitions. With its most valuable assets nationalized by a foreign government, Anaconda's financial position was devastated. The appetite for pouring capital into a marginal underground mine on the British Columbia coast, a mine that had already been operating for over 60 years, with tunnels that extended below sea level and a concentrator that was half a century old, evaporated. Anaconda didn't abandon Britannia immediately. The mine continued operating through the early 1970s, sustained by a copper market that was, for a brief and extraordinary period, very strong. According to World Bank data, the LME copper price reached an all-time high of $1.52 per pound on April 1, 1974. Then the floor gave way. By December 1974, the monthly average copper price had fallen to 58 cents per pound, a drop of 62% in 8 months. World consumption of refined copper declined by over 6% in 1974, driven by the 1973 oil crisis and the global recession that followed. Industrial materials prices, which had risen 127% over 2 years to their April 1974 peak, declined by 40% by June 1975. It was the most extreme commodity boom and bust cycle in over a century. At the same moment the copper price was collapsing, the political ground in British Columbia was shifting beneath Anaconda's feet. Dave Barrett's NDP won the provincial election on August 30, 1972, the province's first social democratic government. The NDP introduced the Mineral Royalties Act, significantly increasing royalties on minerals. Coal royalties jumped from 25 cents to $1.50 per ton. Corporation taxes rose from 10 to 12%. The mining industry was furious. The NDP also passed pro-labor legislation, increased minimum wages, the right to strike for government employees, a union-friendly labor code, all of which raised anticipated operating costs for a mine that was already running on razor-thin margins. A pollution control order was issued to Britannia just before closure. It had no material effect. The mine was already on its way out. What killed Britannia was not any single blow. It was a convergence. At least 7 factors arriving simultaneously, each one survivable alone, altogether fatal. The copper price collapse, 62% in 8 months. Rising costs from aging equipment. The concentrator was over 50 years old. Increased taxation under the Barrett NDP government. Growing competition from massive open-pit operations in Chile, Zambia, and Australia, producing copper at a fraction of Britannia's per-unit cost. High grading. The richest ores had been selectively extracted over decades, leaving reserves grading only 1.1 to 1.4% copper, a pale shadow of the ore that had built the empire. Anticipated higher labor costs under new union-friendly legislation, and Anaconda's own financial weakness following the Chilean expropriation that had gutted its balance sheet. No evidence of government subsidy negotiations or rescue attempts has been found. The Barrett NDP government was ideologically unlikely to subsidize a foreign-owned American mining company. No named executive at Anaconda, Canada, who made the final closure call has been identified in public records. The decision was made at Anaconda's corporate level, somewhere in a boardroom in New York or Montana, by people who had never ridden the miner's train into the dark, who had never watched the sun disappear behind the mountains in November and not return until January, who had never stood inside the concentrator and felt the floor vibrate beneath their boots. The calculation was run. Britannia was on the wrong side of it. Chapter 9. The Last Shift. In October 1974, all employees received notification that the mine was closing. November 1st, 1974 was the final day. The last ore was processed through the 52-year-old concentrator. Approximately 300 employees lost their jobs. The ball mills that had consumed 2.5 pounds of steel per ton of ore for half a century ground their last batch. The water stopped flowing through the flotation cells. The building that had vibrated without pause since January 1923 fell silent. Marshall Teichauer, who worked at the mine for 9 years and met his future wife there, described what the daily routine had been like. Riding the miner's train, 40 men to a car, into pitch-black tunnels for 45-minute journeys to reach mining sites deep inside the mountain. At closure, workers had been renting bunkhouse rooms for approximately $20 per month. It wasn't much of a life by some measures, but it was a life. The Anaconda installed a thick concrete plug 400 meters from the portal of the 4,100 level at it and walked away. The company did not attempt environmental cleanup. Environmental protection laws had not yet been enacted with sufficient force. The Fisheries Act, which theoretically prohibited the deposit of deleterious substances into fish-bearing waters, was never enforced at the site. The concrete plug sealed the tunnel mouth the way a bandage covers a wound without treating the infection underneath. The community response was muted. The 1958 shutdown had already divided the town and left many feeling helpless. By 1974, many workers had mentally prepared for the end. They dispersed to other mining operations, to Vancouver just 55 kilometers south, to Squamish, to wherever work could be found, though the upper town site at Mount Shear was abandoned. The community hall, general store, church, cinema, and bunkhouses were gradually demolished or left to the rain and the snow and the patient advance of the forest. Britannia Beach faced the prospect of becoming a mining ghost town, another name on the long list of places that were built for a single purpose, and, when that purpose ended, had no reason to exist. But preservation efforts had already begun. In 1967, a Centennial Committee had commissioned Bruce Ramsay to author Britannia, the story of a mine. In 1971, the committee restructured as the Britannia Beach Historical Society. In 1975, just 1 year after the last shift, the British Columbia Museum of Mining opened to the public. The speed of that transition, from active mine to heritage site, this suggested that some people in the community had understood for years that the mine's future lay in memory, not in copper. The concentrator still stood. 20 stories of concrete and steel, empty now. The ball mills motionless, the flotation cells dry, the grinding silence where the grinding noise had been. Rain fell on the building the way it had always fallen. 2,400 millimeters a year, 89% of it as rainfall. But now, the rain had nothing to compete with. No machinery, no voices, no vibration in the floor, just the water. Falling on the mountain, seeping into the tunnels, beginning a chemical reaction that would make the mine's 70 years of copper extraction look like a minor disturbance compared to what came next. Chapter 10. The Poison in the Mountain. The wealth and the poison were always the same substance. Dincalcopyrite, copper iron sulfide, was the mineral that made Britannia's fortune. Dig it out, crush it, float it, smelt it, and you had copper. Leave it in the ground, exposed to air and water in 210 kilometers of abandoned tunnels, and you had something else entirely. Acid mine drainage. The chemistry is simple and merciless. When sulfide-bearing minerals, iron pyrite, chalcopyrite, galena, sphalerite, are exposed to oxygen and water, oxidation generates sulfuric acid and dissolved heavy metals. The anaerobic bacteria, Ferrobacillus feroxidans, accelerate the process, feeding on the reaction products and speeding the cycle. High snowfall and heavy rainfall. The 2,200 level area once recorded 348 inches, nearly 9 meters, of precipitation in a single year, flowed through the abandoned tunnels, leaching metals and flushing acid into Britannia Creek and Howe Sound. The scale of the pollution was staggering. Approximately 5 million cubic meters of acidic water, pH 3.0 to 3.8, compared to normal seawater at pH 8, discharged from the mine workings annually. Up to 600 kilograms of heavy metals per day, copper, zinc, cadmium, iron, manganese, aluminum, were deposited into Howe Sound. Dissolved copper concentrations in surface waters near the creek mouth reached 1,009 micrograms per liter. Up to 50 million liters of toxic runoff flowed from the mine site daily. 44 million tons of tailings, the waste from 70 years of processing, had been discharged first directly into the creek, then piped into the Sound. Environment Canada designated Britannia as the worst point source of mineral contamination in North America. Not the worst in British Columbia, not the worst in Canada, the worst on the continent. Britannia Creek became completely devoid of life. No fish, no aquatic insects, nothing. The creek ran crystal clear, deceptively beautiful, because nothing lived in it to cloud the water. The clarity was death's signature. A dead zone extended several kilometers along the Howe Sound shoreline. Divers described the seabed near Britannia Beach as a moonscape. They couldn't find algae. Caged Chinook salmon placed off Britannia Creek died in less than 48 hours, while fish held off Porto Cove to the south had 100% survival. At one point, 4.5 million juvenile chum salmon from the nearby Squamish estuary were wiped out. Blue mussels vanished from contaminated areas. Salmon stopped running up the creek. Dolphins stopped entering the Sound. Seals disappeared. Orcas no longer summered or calved in Howe Sound. Herring vanished. Federal fisheries researchers Colin D. Levings and Karen L. Berry documented these impacts in peer-reviewed studies throughout the 1990s and 2000s. The mine had produced over 1 billion pounds of copper. The abandoned tunnels were now producing 600 kilograms of poison every single day, and they would continue producing it, in theory, forever. The cleanup took decades. The property changed hands. In 1977, Atlantic Richfield acquired Anaconda. In 1979, the mine property was sold to Copper Beach Estates, a Vancouver real estate developer represented by Tim Drummond. Copper Beach was supposed to handle environmental remediation. Instead, the company was consistently in non-compliance with remediation orders and ultimately became insolvent. The mountain's poison outlasted every entity tasked with cleaning it up. The legal game-changer came in 1997, the BC Contaminated Sites Regulation, patterned on American Superfund law, granting powers to find past mine owners, absolutely, retroactively, and jointly and separately liable for cleanup costs. The province pursued Arco, Alcoa, and several remnant companies through the courts. The Fraser Basin Council entered as facilitator in 1998. In April 2001, a settlement was reached. The province and former mine owners agreed on $30 million in 2 cash payments to discharge the company's liability. Environmental scientist Robert G. McCandless of Environment Canada, who was part of the joint federal-provincial effort from 1994 to 2002, later described the Cabinet's decision to accept $30 million against total costs exceeding $75 million as questionable. The mountain's debt was discounted. The companies walked away. The province was left holding the bill. In December 2001, a critical intervention. The UBC Millennium Plug, a concrete barrier installed at the 2,200-foot level mine entrance, stopped pollution from flowing into Jane Creek. This was led by Dr. John Meach of UBC's Center for Environmental Research in Minerals, Metals, and Materials. But he called it the Britannia Project. Dr. Meach died in February 2015 before he could see the full results of what his work set in motion. The water treatment plant that ultimately saved Howe Sound cost $15.5 million, built through a public-private partnership between the province and EPCOR Water Services. Completed in a single year, 2005 to 2006, and fully operational by 2006, The system uses high-density sludge lime treatment. Contaminated mine water is collected from underground. Lime slurry raises the pH from 3.8 to 9.3. Dissolved metals precipitate into particles. A customized polymer attracts and settles them, and clean water is discharged through a deep outfall at 50 meters into Howe Sound. The plant treats an average of 4.2 billion liters of runoff annually. It removes approximately 600,000 kilograms of heavy metals per year, enough copper to mint 70 million pennies. A micro-hydroelectric turbine at the mine water discharge point generates roughly half the plant's electricity. By 2008, 99% of the pollution had been stopped. In December 2025, Vancouver-based BQE Water signed a new 20-year contract to operate and maintain the plant, succeeding EPCOR. The plant will require operation in perpetuity. The acid mine drainage will never stop naturally. Total estimated cleanup costs have exceeded $75 to $100 million, and the meter is still running. The mountain's environmental debt will outlast every person, every company, and every government that created it. Chapter 11. What the Water Remembers. In 2010, a gray whale was spotted in Howe Sound for the first time in 100 years. In 2011, pink salmon returned to Britannia Creek, the first time in over a century. Researchers describe the moment as sparking much jubilation. Salmon have continued returning every subsequent cycle. Pacific white-sided dolphins now appear in megapods. Orca and humpback whales have returned to the Sound. Herring came back, triggering a cascade of marine life recovery. Shellfish recolonized the nearby seabed. Fisheries reopened. In 2015, the first commercial pink salmon fishery in Howe Sound in decades harvested 282,411 fish. And then came a discovery that nobody expected. Howe Sound's recovering waters revealed living glass sponge reefs, organisms previously thought to have been extinct for 40 million years since the Cretaceous period. Their presence contributed to a designation that would have seemed unimaginable in the decades when the Sound was a dead zone. In September 2021, Howe Sound was named a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, Atlaca Seventsum/Textuniu Seventis/Howe Sound, in recognition of its recovery and biodiversity. Mark Angelo, the longtime environmental advocate who served as chair of BCIT's Rivers Institute and had named Britannia Creek British Columbia's most endangered river in 2001, was a key figure throughout the remediation campaign. He received the Order of Canada and the Order of British Columbia and founded World Rivers Day. His decades of advocacy helped keep public pressure on governments and corporations when it would have been easier and cheaper to let the mountain keep poisoning the fjord. The museum found its voice too. In October 2010, the British Columbia Museum of Mining was renamed the Britannia Mine Museum after a $14.7 million revitalization. The museum's Boom Experience, a live-action, multi-sensory show inside the 20-story Concentrator with multiple screens, 30-plus speakers, and special effects, received the prestigious T. Thea Award in April 2022. The 10-acre site now offers underground mine train tours through a historic 1914 haulage tunnel, gold panning, mineral galleries, and environmental education exhibits about the very acid mine drainage that nearly destroyed the Sound. The museum holds over 7,000 artifacts, 9,500 archive photographs, and more than 3,000 archival documents. It draws over 70,000 visitors annually and celebrated its 50th anniversary in May 2025. In 1987, the Britannia Mines Concentrator was designated a National Historic Site of Canada, recognized as an important source of copper for almost 70 years. One of the largest mining operations in Canada during the 1920s and 1930s, and an innovative example of gravity-fed mineral processing. The concentrator still stands on the mountainside. 20 stories of concrete and steel, visible from the water the way it has been visible since 1923, though what happens inside is no longer the grinding of ore into copper concentrate, but the quieter business of remembering. Tourists ride the mine train into tunnels where men once worked in darkness for 45 minutes before reaching their stations. Children pan for gold in water that has been treated and cleaned. The ball mills are silent. The flotation cells are dry. The building that shook the mountainside for half a century now shakes with nothing but the footsteps of visitors and the sound of rain on concrete. The same rain that falls on the treatment plant down the slope. The same rain that seeps into the 210 kilometers of tunnels still riddled through the mountain's interior, still dissolving sulfide minerals, still generating acid, still requiring a machine to undo what 70 years of mining set in motion. The plant runs every day. It will run tomorrow. It will run next year. It will run after everyone who ever worked in the mine, or loved someone who did, or remembers what it sounded like when the concentrator was alive, is gone. 600,000 kilograms of heavy metals per year. 70 million pennies worth of copper. Pulled from water that will be toxic for longer than anyone can reasonably calculate. Pulled from water and disposed of, year after year, in perpetuity, by a machine built to correct a debt that was incurred when a dying deer kicked moss off a rock in 1888 and a doctor with a stick of dynamite found copper in the mountain. The wealth and the poison were always the same substance. They always will be.